There was a time when the world was wider than the maps we now hold. A time when the oceans had not yet claimed their full dominion, and coastlines stretched far beyond today's familiar shores. Before the waters rose, before the tides erased their memories, whole landscapes existed, green plains, winding rivers, and gentle valleys where our ancestors once thrived. This was the world before the waves. The last ice age had only recently released its grip on the earth. Vast glaciers retreated northward, leaving behind fertile ground. The air was softer, the climate warmer, and the rhythm of life began to change. For thousands of years, human beings had followed the migrations of animals across tundra and plain. But as the ice melted, the seas slowly crept forward. The change was not immediate. It was patient, steady, unnoticed at first, like a whisper that grows into a roar. Yet, in these fleeting centuries before the flood, there were settlements along coastlines now drowned. Families built shelters of wood and reed. They lit fires beneath open skies. They fished in shallow waters and hunted along estuaries that no longer exist. Children grew up chasing crabs in tidal pools, their laughter echoing across shores that today are hidden beneath the sea. This was not an age of grandeur or empire. It was an age of intimacy, of survival, of learning how to live at the fragile boundary between land and water. The sea was both provider and mystery. Its tides delivered fish, salt, and shells that could be carved into ornaments. Its horizon promised journeys into the unknown. But even in those earliest days, people understood that the ocean was never truly tame. Storms would roll in, winds would whip across the shallows, and the waves would pound the fragile settlements with fury. Still, they returned to the water's edge, for here life was richest and survival most secure. Imagine standing on such a shoreline 10,000 years ago. To the west lies a vast plain, stretching where today only waves can be seen. Herds of red deer graze where fish now swim. Marshes glisten with reeds and wildfowl. Rivers wander lazily toward the sea, their banks lined with willow and alder. It is a world alive, abundant, and unsuspecting of the fate that awaits. The people who lived here could not know that their home was only temporary, a borrowed land on the verge of vanishing. Archaeology has given us fragments of this world, stone tools buried deep in silt, hearths now submerged, footprints preserved in mud long before the tide returned. Each artifact is a message in a bottle, cast forward through time. They remind us that these places were not abstract landscapes. They were homes, places of laughter, of mourning, of ritual. They held the weight of human stories, no less rich than our own. The bond between early humans and the ocean was spiritual as much as practical. In carvings and in myths, the sea appears as a living presence, a mother, a monster, a god. Waves became symbols of rebirth and destruction. Tides marked the passing of time, guiding rituals and seasons. It was as though people already sensed that this relationship with the water was fragile, precarious, destined for change. In the quiet before the catastrophe, life carried on. Fires burned in the darkness. Songs were sung in languages we will never recover. Hands wove nets and shaped vessels of clay. Generations were born, lived, and died along these forgotten coasts, unaware that their story was temporary. To them, the land seemed eternal. To us, it is a ghostly reminder of how fragile the ground beneath our feet can be. The earth itself was shifting. Ice caps melted, and rivers of glacial water poured into the oceans. Slowly, relentlessly, the seas rose. Year by year, the shoreline retreated. Fields turned to marsh. Marshes gave way to saltwater. Entire villages watched their hunting grounds vanish, their sacred sites swallowed. And yet, because the change was slow, most did not flee immediately. Instead, they adapted, moving a little farther inland each generation, carrying their memories of lost lands with them. But not all could escape. Some stayed, clinging to the only home they had ever known. For them, the end would not come as a whisper. It would come suddenly, in a night of storm and fury, when the ocean rose higher than it ever had before. Their fires would be extinguished, their voices silenced, their dwellings torn apart by waves. And when the storm cleared, nothing remained but a silent sea. Today, if you sail over these drowned plains, you would never suspect what lies beneath. The waves conceal entire chapters of human history, cities, villages, forests, fields, all buried in silence. The ocean remembers, but it does not reveal easily. It guards these places with depth and darkness, leaving only fragments for us to piece together. And so we begin our story, not in myth nor in fantasy, but in truth. A truth written in stone tools and flood myths, in drowned forests and shifting sands. A truth that tells us the ocean is not merely a backdrop to human history, but an actor, powerful, merciless, and eternal. This is the stage on which our ancestors once walked. This is the world before the waves. A world now hidden, but not forgotten. For in its disappearance, it left us a warning, that the line between land and sea is never fixed, and that every civilization built upon the shore must one day answer to the tides. And so, as we turn our gaze to the vanished coastlines, let us listen to the silence beneath the waves. For in that silence lie the first echoes of a story that will unfold across millennia, a story of people, of oceans, and of what it means to be fragile before eternity. They came to the edge of the world not as conquerors, but as wanderers. Drawn by the glimmer of water, the abundance of fish, the promise of fertile estuaries, they built their lives where land met sea. Long before cities and empires, before the age of stone walls and temples, there were small clusters of families huddled close to the shore who discovered that survival was richest at the boundary of the tide. These were the first settlers of the coast. They were not nameless or faceless, though time has taken their voices. They were mothers who taught children how to weave nets, fathers who shaped boats from hollowed logs, grandparents who told stories by the fire, teaching that the sea was alive and that to live beside it was to live in balance. Their homes were simple huts of reed, wood, and animal hide, clustered along ridges where they could look out at the water's vastness. The shoreline was their marketplace. Fish glistened in shallow pools, crabs scuttled along rocks, and mussels clung to tidal flats. These early people learned the rhythms of the tide, the movements of fish, the habits of birds. They wove baskets to trap eels, sharpened spears to hunt seals, and carved hooks from bone. Food was not scarce here, it was abundant. And so, while inland tribes followed the migrations of herds, the coastal settlers found stability. The ocean gave, and they learned to receive. Yet, their world was more than survival. Ritual and meaning flowed through their daily lives. Archaeologists have found ornaments carved from shells, beads fashioned from coral, and ochre-stained stones used for ceremonies. These are not the marks of a people merely surviving. They are the signs of communities that dreamed, that believed, that sought to make sense of their place beside the water. Perhaps they sang to the waves or whispered prayers before setting out in small boats. Perhaps they told stories of great spirits dwelling beneath the surface. To live at the ocean's edge was to live with contrast. On calm days, the sea stretched out like glass, a mirror reflecting the heavens. But when storms gathered, the same sea turned hostile. Waves pounding against the shore, winds tearing at the fragile huts. For the settlers, this duality was familiar. They did not curse the sea for its anger, nor worship it blindly for its gifts. They accepted it as it was, unpredictable, powerful, essential. Picture an evening in their world. The sun sinks low, painting the horizon with gold and crimson. Smoke curls upward from fires where fish are roasting. Children laugh, chasing each other along the sand. Nets, heavy with the day's catch, dry in the wind. A storyteller begins to speak, and all fall silent. The tale may be of ancestors who first walked the shore, or of spirits that command the tides. The story is old, carried in memory, reshaped each time it is told. Around the firelight, shadows dance, and the ocean answers with the hush of its waves. For these people, community was not an abstract concept. It was life itself. Without the group, survival was impossible. Each person carried a role: fisher, gatherer, toolmaker, healer. Knowledge was shared, not hoarded. When one family ate, all ate. When tragedy struck, all mourned. Their bonds were woven not only by necessity, but by love, ritual, and shared memory. These early coastal societies were fragile in numbers, but rich in meaning. And yet, despite their closeness, they could not foresee what was coming. To them, the land was solid, eternal. The beach where their children played seemed fixed forever. They could not imagine that the very earth beneath their huts would one day be lost to the waves. Their maps were not drawn on parchment, but in memory: rivers, hunting grounds, sacred groves. They had no inkling that one day, those same paths would vanish, replaced by an ocean that seemed then so distant. Still, clues remain in the soil and seabed. Archaeologists have uncovered hearths, fragments of pottery, and the post holes of huts long buried. Each discovery is a whisper from the past, reminding us that these people were here, that they lived fully human lives, rich with laughter, fear, wonder, and hope. When we peer into these fragments, we glimpse not primitives, but people much like ourselves, vulnerable to nature, yet endlessly resilient. Their world was defined by immediacy. To survive, they needed only to look around: the fish, the reeds, the timber. But their dreams, their stories, pointed beyond survival. The carved shell pendants, the painted stones, the careful burial of their dead, these tell us they sought meaning beyond the hunt. They wanted to belong, not just to a tribe, but to a cosmos alive with mystery. The ocean, vast and unknowable, became both their mirror and their guide. In their footsteps, we see ourselves. Modern humanity, with our cities and machines, still gathers at the edge of the sea. We build harbors, light fires, tell stories, as waves echo in the distance. The settlers of 10,000 years ago may seem far removed, but the rhythms of their lives remain in ours. We too are drawn to the water's edge, both in awe and in peril. And so, at the dawn of their world, these first settlers made a choice, not to flee from the sea's uncertainty, but to embrace it. They chose to live at the fragile threshold where abundance met danger, where beauty met chaos. It was a choice that would define their fate, for, in the centuries to come, the waters that gave them life would rise against them. The ocean that had fed their children would one day claim their homes. And in that claiming, an entire people would be remembered only in silence, swallowed by the sea they once trusted. To the people of the coasts, the sea was not a backdrop. It was a presence, a force that defined their days, shaped their rituals, and filled their stories. The ocean was their mother, abundant, nourishing, generous beyond measure. Yet, in the same breath, it was their tyrant, merciless, unpredictable, and unbound by human need. To live at the shore was to live within this paradox, suspended between awe and fear, gratitude and dread. At dawn, the water stretched calm and luminous, reflecting the rising sun in 1,000 shards of light. To the settlers, this was beauty incarnate. The ocean's bounty awaited, nets heavy with fish, traps filled with shellfish, the occasional gift of a stranded whale that would feed the entire community. Here, the sea provided not only food, but life itself. Without its offerings, settlements could not have grown, families could not have thrived. In the embrace of the ocean, they found security. But the same water that brought sustenance could, at any moment, turn hostile. Storms rose swiftly, summoned by winds beyond the horizon. What was once a shimmering plain became a battlefield of waves. Boats capsized, lives were lost, dwellings shattered. Even when the sea calmed again, it left scars, huts reduced to splinters, stores of food swept away, sacred objects carried into the deep. The ocean demanded reverence, not merely respect. This duality echoed in their myths. Across the ancient world, stories emerged of water spirits, sea deities, and monstrous beings lurking beneath the waves. To the people of early coasts, these were not fanciful tales, but attempts to give shape to the unexplainable. The ocean could not be reasoned with, but perhaps it could be appeased. Offerings were cast into the surf, shells, bones, sometimes even the ashes of the dead. These rituals were gestures of humility, acknowledgments of human smallness before the endless expanse. Imagine a stormy night. Lightning splits the horizon, and waves slam against the shore. Families huddle in their huts, listening as the wind howls like a living beast. Children cry. Elders whisper words of protection, invoking spirits that dwell in water. For them, the ocean was not mere geography, it was alive. It had moods, desires, tempers. It was both benefactor and executioner. Yet, this very danger drew them closer. To live beside the sea was to live with mystery. The horizon was infinite, a line that beckoned the imagination. What lay beyond? Other lands? Other peoples? Or only endless water? Some were brave enough to venture out in boats of wood and hide, risking their lives for the promise of new shores. In this way, the ocean became a teacher of courage, of curiosity. It dared humanity to move beyond its boundaries, to test itself against the unknown. The settlers who embraced this paradox built entire ways of life around its rhythms. Tides marked the passage of time, moons guided fishing expeditions, stars reflected in the water showed pathways to distant places. The ocean was their calendar, their larder, their map, their mirror. To ignore it was to starve. To trust it blindly was to perish. Only those who listened, who adapted, could endure. Archaeological evidence confirms this delicate balance. In sites now submerged, we find tools fashioned specifically for marine life, harpoons, net weights, boats carved with precision. These were not the inventions of wanderers who merely stumbled upon the shore. They were the innovations of people who had studied the sea, observed its moods, and learned to coexist with it. Such knowledge was passed down like sacred inheritance, a chain of wisdom stretching across generations. But for all their skill, they never tamed the sea. It remained wild, untouchable. The ocean was not theirs to command, but theirs to endure. And in this tension, their lives gained meaning. Every meal was a gift from waters that might tomorrow destroy them. Every fire lit against the storm was a testament to their will to survive. The ocean's tyranny was real, but so too was its generosity. It demanded resilience, humility, and above all, reverence. We see echoes of this relationship even today. In fishing villages scattered across the modern world, the sea is still spoken of in tones of awe. Blessings are still whispered before voyages, rituals still performed at the water's edge. Though centuries have passed, though technology has changed, the essence remains. Humanity cannot escape the paradox of the ocean. It is life-giver and life-taker, a presence both maternal and tyrannical. And perhaps this is why stories of great floods, of drowned lands, of vanished peoples are so enduring. They are not only memories of catastrophe, they are acknowledgments of a truth deeper than history, that to live by the sea is to live with loss always near. That abundance and ruin are bound together, inseparable, inevitable. The settlers of the ancient coastlines understood this better than we may realize. Their myths, their rituals, their ways of life were not naive superstition, but wisdom drawn from lived experience. They knew the ocean could not be trusted, yet they remained by its side. They chose to live within the paradox because the gifts outweighed the risks, until the day the balance tipped forever. The ocean as mother, the ocean as tyrant, the two faces of a single force. A force that shaped not only their lives, but their fate. For one day, the hand that fed them would become the hand that claimed them. And in that claiming, a people would vanish, leaving behind only fragments, stories, and the silence of a world drowned. Beneath the waves, beyond the reach of sunlight, lie coastlines that no human eye has seen for thousands of years. Places once alive with forests, rivers, and villages now rest in silence. To imagine them is to imagine a world erased, a world that once stretched where today only open sea remains. These are the landscapes of a forgotten shore. When the last ice age ended, glaciers retreated, and oceans began their slow ascent. What we now call coastlines were not fixed boundaries, but shifting margins. 10,000 years ago, much of northern Europe, Asia, and the Americas were larger, their shorelines extended dozens, even hundreds, of miles farther than today. The land we walk on now was once only the higher ridges of sprawling plains. Beneath the waters of the North Sea, the Mediterranean, and the Indian Ocean, whole landscapes lie drowned. Consider Doggerland, once a vast stretch of meadows, rivers, and lakes connecting Britain to continental Europe. Archaeologists describe it as a lost paradise, a fertile region rich with game, fish, and plant life. Families built homes along its rivers. Hunters followed red deer across its plains. Gatherers collected berries in its forests. Today, fishermen trawling the North Sea occasionally pull up bones, tools, or mammoth remains, fragments of a vanished land. Each discovery is a reminder that where waves now roll, children once played. Far to the east, beneath the waters near Japan, lies the site of Yonaguni. Here, massive stone formations rest under the ocean, their sharp angles sparking debate. Are they natural formations, or the remnants of an ancient structure built before the sea rose? Whether crafted by human hands or sculpted by nature, Yonaguni whispers of landscapes now inaccessible, mysteries locked in silence. In the Mediterranean, near Greece, lies Pavlopetri, a true submerged city. Streets, courtyards, and houses can still be traced beneath the waves. Here, life once unfolded in all its detail, families walking narrow lanes, merchants trading goods, rituals performed in open squares. But the sea advanced, and the city was claimed, its story hidden until divers rediscovered it thousands of years later. These are not isolated examples. Around the world, coastlines once extended farther than we imagine. In India, off the coast of Gujarat, lies Dwarka, spoken of in myth and partially revealed by archaeology. In the Americas, along the eastern seaboard, ancient shorelines now rest miles offshore. Everywhere the sea rose, everywhere it claimed, and everywhere it left behind fragments of forgotten shores. But what did these landscapes look like in their time? We can reconstruct them through sediment cores, pollen analysis, and sonar mapping. Scientists find traces of willow, birch, and oak, telling us that forests once shaded these plains. They uncover seeds of grasses and grains, evidence that the land was fertile. They find the bones of aurochs, wild horses, and deer, showing that it teemed with life. Where now the seabed lies barren, once rivers wound their way to the sea, their banks alive with birdsong. To walk these drowned lands, if we could, would be to step into a world both familiar and alien. The air would be thick with the scent of wildflowers. Herds of animals would graze along rolling meadows. Families would camp by rivers, fires glowing against the dusk. And always, in the distance, the sea, a reminder that this abundance was not infinite. Yet, for those who lived there, it must have seemed eternal. The rivers carved paths they thought would last forever. The forests grew as though they would never vanish. The plains stretched outward as far as the eye could see. How could they know that the land itself was temporary, borrowed, destined to drown? To them, the world appeared permanent. To us, it is only memory. The ocean's advance was not sudden at first. Year by year, the tide crept forward. Lakes turned to marshes, marshes to estuaries, estuaries to bays. Slowly, the horizon shifted. Villages once inland found themselves on the shore. Sacred places once high and dry became surrounded by saltwater. Families may have moved inland, carrying with them stories of what was lost. But some stayed, clinging to the land even as the sea consumed it. The silence of these drowned landscapes is haunting. When divers descend, they enter a twilight world where fish swim through the remains of hearths, where corals cling to what were once walls, where sand buries the traces of human hands. The ocean preserves, but it also erases. What is left to us are fragments, puzzles, incomplete echoes of lives that will never be whole again. And yet, in their loss, these landscapes teach us something profound. They remind us that human history is not only written on stone and soil, but on land that no longer exists. The maps we hold today are not fixed truths, but snapshots in time. Beneath every ocean, beneath every wave, lies another world waiting to be remembered. The landscapes of a forgotten shore are not gone. They sleep, hidden beneath the sea, veiled in silence. To remember them is to remember our own fragility, and to see with clarity that the ground beneath our feet is never as permanent as we believe. The story of a world swallowed by the sea does not begin with a single wave, nor with a sudden calamity that struck without warning. It begins in whispers, murmurs of change, murmurs of catastrophe. For thousands of years, the earth had been locked in the grip of an ice age. Vast glaciers stretched across continents, holding the oceans captive in frozen form. But as the climate warmed, those colossal walls of ice began to melt. Slowly at first, then with frightening acceleration. Rivers swelled, valleys filled, and inch by inch, the sea began to advance. To us, with satellites and records, these changes are measured in meters and centuries. But to the people who lived them, they were lived realities. The signs were everywhere. A shoreline that seemed a little closer each season. A flood that lingered longer than before. Salt creeping into the soil where crops once grew. Fish that no longer returned to familiar waters. These were not abstractions. They were experiences, unsettling reminders that the world itself was shifting. Elders would gather their communities and tell stories of the land. Stories of where the waters had once ended, of hunting grounds now drowned, of sacred sites lost to the tides. To remember was to warn. To forget was to invite disaster. Oral traditions became a lifeline, a way of preserving fragile knowledge against the rising sea. In these warnings, we hear echoes of myths that have endured across millennia: the flood of Gilgamesh, Noah's Ark, the tale of Manu in India warned by a fish of oncoming waters, indigenous stories across the Pacific and the Americas that speak of villages swept away and survivors climbing to the mountains. Today, they read like allegories, but to those who first told them, they may have been memories, ways of carrying truth through generations, long after the drowned lands themselves were gone. The sea did not always move gently. Sometimes, its murmurs grew violent. A storm would tear across the coast with a ferocity no one had seen before. A tsunami, unleashed by a distant earthquake or submarine landslide, would rise without warning. To watch a single wall of water erase forests, villages, and families in moments, how else could ancient people understand it except as the anger of gods or spirits? Imagine standing on such a shore. One season, you fish in a calm estuary, your boat tied to familiar trees. The next, the same place is an open bay. The trees stand half-drowned, roots rotting in brine. The graves of your ancestors, once safely inland, crumble into the surf. What was stable feels betrayed. The world itself becomes unreliable. Yet humanity endured. People adapted in small ways. They built their dwellings farther inland. They learned to read the weather more carefully. They shifted their diets to the fish and plants of a new environment. Rituals were created to make sense of the chaos, ceremonies to appease the water, songs to remember what had been lost, prayers to hold back what could not be controlled. But adaptation had its limits. With each generation, the sea claimed more. Villages that resisted too long were swept away. Communities that fled too late vanished into silence. And still, the survivors carried their stories forward, stories that were both warnings and memorials. Science, too, has begun to listen to these murmurs. In cores of seabed sediment, we find layers of sand driven inland by ancient tsunamis. In pollen grains trapped deep in marshes, we read the history of drowned forests. Coral reefs bear the marks of sudden jumps in sea level, sometimes meters in the span of a human lifetime. These are the voices of the past, recorded not in words, but in the earth itself. And when we compare them with the myths, they align. The floods were not metaphors, they were lived truths. The murmurs of catastrophe grew louder as millennia passed. Doggerland, once a vast plain connecting Britain to Europe, became smaller with each century. Families who had lived there for generations were forced to abandon it, watching their homeland break apart into islands before vanishing entirely. Along the Mediterranean, entire coastal settlements disappeared. In Asia, villages near India's shores were claimed by advancing tides. In every region, the same refrain repeated: the sea was advancing, and the people were retreating. But memory has its limits. Even the strongest story fades if there are no survivors left to tell it. When the waters finally came in their full force, whether through storms, surges, or centuries of advance, they did more than erase land. They erased entire ways of life, languages, rituals, knowledge, all drowned. What survived were fragments, stone tools buried in silt, wooden posts trapped beneath the sea floor, myths retold so many times that their origins blurred into legend. This was the cruelest truth of all: catastrophe was not a single moment, but a slow creeping inevitability. At first, it whispered, then it grew louder, until finally, it roared. For the people of these ancient coasts, life was not simply lived against the backdrop of nature. Life was a negotiation with it. Every decision, every story, every prayer was colored by the knowledge that the sea could one day claim it all. And for many, that day came. Murmurs of catastrophe remind us that disasters rarely arrive as sudden shocks. They come quietly, in signs overlooked or explained away, until one day the signs become undeniable. For ancient people, the whispers of the rising sea were always there. And when those whispers grew into shouts, their world ended. At first, it seemed as though the sea had come and gone. The wave had thundered ashore, shattered homes, and dragged lives into darkness, and then it had retreated, leaving silence. But the silence was deceptive. What the people soon discovered was that the sea had not truly gone. It had changed the land itself. When dawn broke after the night of terror, survivors walked in stunned disbelief. The horizon no longer looked familiar. Where there had been dry soil and grazing fields, now there was water. The wave had carved a new shape onto the earth. Lowlands that once held farms and forests were drowned beneath shallow lagoons. Saltwater spread where freshwater streams had flowed. Rivers overflowed, unable to find their old paths. The plains were no longer plains, they had become a vast, gleaming mirror of the sea. The people stepped cautiously into this new world. Mud sucked at their feet. Trees stood half submerged, their roots blackened and rotting. Dead fish floated in the still pools, mingled with human tools and broken pottery. The air smelled of salt and decay, heavy and oppressive. For generations, these lands had been home, a place of memory, of graves, of harvest. Now they were unrecognizable. The water shimmered where crops should have grown, mocking the rhythms of life that had once been so steady. For the survivors, the drowned plains carried a double weight. They were both a grave and a reminder. Every flooded hollow held the memory of those who had been lost. The voices of the dead seemed to echo in the rippling pools, as if the land itself was whispering. Each step into the water was a reminder that the world could vanish overnight. Over time, the floodwaters did not recede. They lingered. Salt poisoned the soil. Freshwater springs were tainted. Where once villages had stood, only marshes remained. The people who tried to stay soon realized they could not rebuild what had been taken. Fields refused to yield. The earth resisted the plow. Slowly, painfully, families were forced to leave. And so began the wandering. Groups packed what little they could carry and moved inland, searching for higher ground. They left behind the drowned plains, not because they wished to, but because the land itself had abandoned them. To stay was to starve. To stay was to live among the ghosts. But they did not forget. Even as they left, they carried with them stories. They pointed to the drowned trees, the half-buried hearths, the layers of sand that lay across the earth like scars. They told their children, "This was once our home. This is what the sea can do." The drowned plains became not only a memory of disaster, but also a warning. Archaeologists today uncover fragments of this lost world. Beneath modern seas, divers find forests that once stood tall, their stumps preserved for thousands of years. In places like Doggerland, a vast plain that once connected Britain to Europe, scientists reveal entire landscapes drowned by rising waters. There, beneath the waves, lie traces of settlements, tools, and bones, silent evidence of a world erased. Each discovery is like a voice rising from the water, reminding us that the drowned plains were once alive with laughter, work, and song. What is most haunting is not simply the loss of land, but the intimacy of it. These were not barren wastes consumed by the sea. They were fertile, generous places, the heart of life for countless families. To imagine them drowned is to imagine memory itself submerged. The hearths where stories were told, the paths children ran along, the fields where elders worked, all of it silenced beneath water. In time, myths grew around these vanished landscapes. Some said the drowned plains were taken as punishment, that the people had angered the gods. Others said the land had been swallowed by a great serpent, or stolen by jealous spirits. Still others whispered that the drowned plains were not gone at all, but existed just beneath the surface, waiting like a sleeping kingdom. On quiet nights, fishermen swore they could hear the faint ringing of bells beneath the sea, as though the lost villages still prayed from the depths. These myths reveal something profound. When people looked at the drowned plains, they did not see only water. They saw a mirror of human fragility. They saw how easily the familiar can vanish. They saw how memory is tied to place, and how the loss of place is a wound to the soul. Even now, when we look at modern maps of coastlines, we rarely think of what lies beneath. Yet beneath the seas are entire worlds, forests, rivers, settlements, the bones of animals and humans alike. The drowned plains are reminders that land and sea are never fixed, that the boundary between them is fragile, shifting, and temporary. For the ancients, these plains became sacred in their absence. Pilgrimages were made to their edges, where the waters lapped against what had once been home. Offerings were thrown into the shallows, shells, carved stones, small tokens of remembrance. The drowned plains became holy ground, not because they were visible, but because they were lost. To walk their edges was to feel the weight of time. To speak of them was to pass on warning and wisdom. And so, generation after generation, the drowned plains lived on in story, long after their soil had vanished beneath the tide. The drowned plains teach us that memory is not only preserved in stone or bone, but also in silence, in the places where the sea hides what once was. To listen to the drowned plains is to listen to the voice of the earth itself, whispering that nothing lasts forever. The sea had not only swallowed the land, it had uprooted its people. For those who survived, life became a long journey, a slow and painful search for new ground. To lose a home is not just to lose walls and hearths, it is to lose the very rhythm of being. When the drowned plains sank beneath the tide, the survivors carried with them more than bundles of food and tools. They carried grief, and they carried memory. The exodus began in small groups. Families who had once lived side by side now drifted apart, each taking a different path into the unknown. Some moved inland, climbing the ridges and hills that had once been boundaries. Others followed rivers, hoping they would lead to fertile valleys untouched by the salt. Each group carried only what they could bear. Heavy stones that once anchored hearths were left behind, pots shattered rather than transported. What they brought instead were seeds, tools of survival, and the stories of what had been lost. To walk away from a drowned home was an act of both necessity and mourning. Survivors looked back at the shimmering plains, still dotted with half-drowned trees and broken rooftops, and they felt as though they were abandoning the dead. Every step inland was a step away from the graves of ancestors, from the hearths that had once gathered families together. Some lingered too long, reluctant to leave. Others wept as they went, torn between survival and loyalty to the land that had sustained them. The journeys were long and uncertain. Food grew scarce, for the soil inland was different, unfamiliar. Hunting routes had to be relearned. Rivers had to be crossed. Nights were filled with both fear and silence. Around their fires, the survivors whispered about the sea, about the wave, about the people who had not escaped. They spoke to keep the memory alive, but also to make sense of what had happened. The stories became a lifeline, a way of weaving the past into the present, of ensuring that loss did not dissolve into silence. Memory in this time became a form of survival. To remember was to keep identity intact. Parents taught their children not only how to set traps or find routes, but also how to speak the names of the drowned villages. They pointed to the horizon and said, "There, beneath that water, lies the land of our ancestors." The drowned world lived on in words, and words became anchors in a shifting life. The Exodus reshaped human culture. As groups scattered, they mingled with others. Strangers became kin. New alliances were forged. But even as they adapted, the memory of loss lingered like a shadow. Some communities carried the trauma in their rituals. Fires were lit to honor the dead. Offerings were placed in rivers as gifts for the ancestors who had vanished. Songs were sung, not of triumph or conquest, but of mourning. These songs carried the rhythm of the waves, echoing the night the sea rose. Generations later, these memories hardened into legend. Children grew up hearing of the time when the sea swallowed the people. They had never seen the drowned plains themselves, yet they knew their names. They could describe them with detail inherited from their elders. In this way, memory survived the erosion of time. Even when the physical land was gone, it persisted in the minds of those who had left. Archaeology today uncovers the faint traces of these journeys. Flint tools found far inland, carved from stone, carried from distant coasts. Fragments of pottery showing styles that once belonged to drowned settlements, appearing hundreds of miles away. Evidence of people who carried not only their belongings but also their traditions as they wandered. The ground itself bears witness to exodus, paths worn into soil by countless feet, bones buried far from where their stories began. There is a strange duality in this memory. On one hand, it is grief, a reminder that everything familiar can be stripped away in a single night. On the other hand, it is strength. Those who carried memory also carried resilience. To walk into the unknown, armed only with remembrance, is an act of defiance against loss. By refusing to forget, the survivors ensured that the drowned world still lived. Philosophically, the Exodus reminds us of the fragility of belonging. What does it mean to call a place home when the earth itself can erase it? For the survivors, home became less about land and more about community, less about fixed ground and more about shared memory. In the wandering, identity transformed. A home could be drowned, but a people endured as long as they remembered who they were. We today are not so different. Modern migrations echo these ancient footsteps. Rising seas still displace families. Floods still force people to walk away from their homes. Memory still travels, clutched tightly in stories, in songs, in photographs carried across borders. The ancient exodus of the drowned plains is not only history. It is a mirror of the present and perhaps a warning of the future. The survivors of the drowned world did not see themselves as victims alone. With time, they wove their loss into identity. They said, "We are the people who came from the sea. We are the ones who remember." What began as tragedy became a defining mark of resilience. Their children grew up knowing that survival was possible, even after the ocean had swallowed everything. The Exodus was not an ending. It was a transformation. From the drowned plains rose stories that would echo across generations, binding people together in remembrance. Memory became their compass, guiding them through unknown lands. In memory, the drowned world still lived, shimmering beneath the waves, eternal in story, eternal in song. When we think of archaeology, we imagine ruins rising from the earth, stone circles silhouetted against the sky, temples standing stubborn against time, shards of pottery gleaming in the sand. But the archaeology of the drowned plains is different. It is an archaeology of absence, a discipline of silence, of voids, of fragments, hidden not in open fields but beneath dark water and shifting mud. The ocean conceals what the land once revealed. Villages that might have stood proudly for centuries now rest unseen, scattered across the seabed. Fires once lit in hearths have been extinguished, their ashes dispersed by the tide. The work of archaeologists in such places is not to uncover intact monuments, but to listen for whispers, a flint blade wedged in clay, a scatter of fish bones preserved in silt, the ghostly outline of a wooden post rotted long ago but leaving behind a darker stain in the sediment. This is the paradox of absence. The more the sea erases, the more the human imagination strains to reconstruct what is missing. Standing on a modern coastline, one sees only waves. Yet beneath those waves lies a world that once echoed with voices, laughter, and song. The archaeology of absence teaches us to see not what is before our eyes, but what is no longer visible, the negative space of history carved into the earth by water. Evidence of the drowned world often arrives in fragments. A fisherman hauls up his nets and finds, entangled among the fish, a shard of antler carved by human hands. A diver scours the seabed and uncovers a tool, polished smooth, resting where once there may have been a worksite. These small discoveries remind us that absence is never absolute. The sea hides, but it does not obliterate. Traces linger, scattered like breadcrumbs across the continental shelf. Perhaps the most haunting artifacts are footprints. Along certain coasts, preserved by chance in hardened mud, we find impressions of feet, men, women, children, frozen in the act of walking. Each step speaks across thousands of years. They remind us that absence is not nothingness, it is the residue of presence. Even the vanished leave behind echoes. The people of the drowned plains may be gone, but their steps remain, stamped into mud that once lay beneath their homes, now revealed when tides recede. Absence also exists in the stories passed down through generations. Folktales of sunken lands, of cities swallowed by waves, of gods who punished with floods. These myths are themselves a kind of archaeology. They are the memory of absence, translated into story, preserved not in stone but in words. To an archaeologist, such stories are fragile but invaluable clues. They point to landscapes that may lie hidden, and they remind us that memory itself is an artifact. There is a quiet melancholy to this kind of archaeology. Unlike the triumph of uncovering a grand monument, the archaeology of absence is filled with uncertainty. For every artifact retrieved, there are countless more lost forever. For every hint of a settlement, there are questions that can never be fully answered. What were their names? What songs did they sing as the sea approached? What laughter filled their nights before silence took over? These questions linger in the gaps, unsatisfied, unresolved. And yet, in this very incompleteness, there is a strange beauty. The absence becomes part of the story. The drowned plains resist full recovery just as memory resists full clarity. They remind us that the past is not a fixed photograph, but a shifting shadow. To seek it is to accept that we will never grasp it whole, only in fragments, only in echoes. Archaeologists today use technology to peer into this absence. Sonar scans reveal ridges and depressions on the seabed that may once have been river channels or shorelines. Core samples, drilled from beneath the waves, contain layers of pollen showing which plants once grew where now only saltwater reigns. Through these traces, an outline of the drowned world emerges, faint, incomplete, but undeniable. It is a map not of presence, but of loss. To walk along a modern coastline and imagine the world that lies beneath is to confront the weight of absence. Each wave that crashes hides a story. Each horizon that glimmers conceals a vanished plain. The archaeology of absence asks us to hold two realities at once, the world that is and the world that was. In that tension, we feel both the fragility of human achievement and the enduring stubbornness of human presence. Philosophically, absence carries its own meaning. It reminds us that history is not just what survives, but also what is erased. The silence of the drowned plains is as much a part of human heritage as the ruins that remain standing. Absence is not empty. It is full of possibility, of questions, of longing. It is the space into which imagination pours, reconstructing lives we will never fully know. The archaeology of absence is, in a way, also the archaeology of ourselves. It asks us to reflect on what will remain of our own world centuries from now. When seas rise again, as they surely will, what will be left of our cities, our voices, our memories? Will future generations find only fragments, and will they too wonder at the silences between them? The drowned plains teach us that absence is not an end. It is another form of presence, quieter, more elusive, but no less powerful. Beneath the waves, the people of that world are not gone. They are waiting, preserved in fragments, remembered in story, alive in the imagination of those who seek them. The archaeology of absence is, above all, the archaeology of longing, a human desire to reach across time and recover what the ocean has tried to erase. For thousands of years, human beings have built their lives in harmony with the rhythms of nature. They planted crops in fertile valleys, drank from rivers, and hunted along coastlines where food was abundant. The land seemed generous, the seasons familiar. But hidden within this apparent stability was always a deeper truth: the earth is restless, alive, and capable of sudden catastrophic change. The people of the drowned plains discovered this truth in the most devastating way. To live by the sea was to live in a paradox, nourished by its bounty, yet always threatened by its moods. The ocean offered fish, salt, and pathways of travel, but beneath its calm surface lurked an unpredictable force. On the night when the water rose, nature revealed its full wrath, and human fragility was laid bare. Even today, we are humbled by reminders of that power. Earthquakes rumble through the ground without warning, splitting streets and toppling buildings. Volcanoes, dormant for centuries, awaken in fiery eruptions, sending ash and fire into the sky. Hurricanes gather strength over warm seas, their wind strong enough to shred forests and collapse concrete. Each time, we remember what our ancestors once knew with painful clarity: that the human world is small compared to the world of nature. For the people of prehistory, there were no concrete barriers, no early warning systems, no satellites scanning the skies. Their only defense was instinct, to read the signs of the earth, the swell of the sea, the sudden flight of birds. But even these signs could not prepare them for catastrophe on a scale that seemed divine. A wall of water rushing toward the shore would have been unstoppable. In the face of such power, they were vulnerable, as we remain vulnerable today. Human fragility is not simply about physical survival. It is also about memory, about meaning, about the stories we tell to make sense of disaster. When the sea swallowed their homes, the survivors faced not just the loss of life but the loss of identity. Fields that had belonged to families for generations vanished. Villages that had stood for centuries disappeared without a trace. To see the earth itself dissolve beneath the waves was to confront the truth that nothing, not even the ground beneath one's feet, is permanent. And yet, out of this fragility emerged resilience. The people who lived through disaster did not surrender. They mourned, they remembered, and then they moved. They carried their tools, their songs, and their stories to higher ground. They rebuilt, though never again without the knowledge that the sea could return. Fragility did not mean helplessness. It meant vulnerability paired with endurance, a capacity to continue despite loss. The wrath of nature, paradoxically, has always been both destroyer and teacher. It reminds us of our limits, of the need for humility in the face of forces larger than ourselves. But it also forges bonds within communities, forcing people to rely on one another. After the waves receded, the survivors were bound together by shared memory. They became living witnesses, keepers of a warning for those who came after them: respect the water, respect the land, for they can give and they can take away. In every corner of the world, echoes of this lesson can be found. Myths of great floods appear across cultures, not as coincidence but as memory encoded in story. They remind us that nature's wrath is not bound to one place or one people. It is universal, as is human fragility. From the plains of Mesopotamia to the shores of the Pacific, humanity has wrestled with the same question: how do we live in a world where the ground itself can betray us, where the sea itself can rise against us? Modern science gives us answers in terms of geology, climate, and tectonic plates. But for prehistoric peoples, these forces were gods, spirits, and powers beyond comprehension. A great wave was not just water, it was judgment, fate, destiny. Fragility was not merely physical weakness, it was the recognition that human beings were part of a larger cosmic order, subject to its moods. To survive was to respect that order, to bow before it even while struggling against it. And perhaps this is the deepest truth: fragility and resilience are not opposites. They coexist. It is only because humans are fragile, because their villages could be destroyed, their lives swept away, that resilience carries meaning. To rise after loss, to sing after mourning, to build after destruction, these acts shine brightly only against the darkness of vulnerability. Nature's wrath strips away illusions of permanence, but in doing so, it reveals the strength that lies in adaptation, in memory, in community. The drowned plains, now hidden beneath the waves, are monuments to this lesson. They tell us not only of destruction but of survival. Somewhere inland, descendants of those who fled carried forward their traditions, their ways of life, and their myths. They adapted, as humans always have. Their story is not one of annihilation, but of transformation, fragile bodies enduring within a fragile world, yet finding ways to continue. Even today, as the seas rise again with a warming climate, we are forced to confront the same truth. Our cities, our technologies, our illusions of control, all are fragile when the earth reminds us of its power. Storms intensify, shorelines erode, rivers overflow. The story of the drowned people is not a relic of the past. It is a mirror held up to our present and perhaps to our future. Nature's wrath is not cruelty. It is simply force, blind and indifferent. But human fragility, when met with resilience, transforms catastrophe into story and story into memory. And memory, carried across generations, becomes wisdom. The drowned plains whisper to us still: do not forget. Do not grow arrogant. Do not believe that the ground beneath your feet is eternal. To live in harmony with the earth is not to conquer it, but to listen to it, to remember that its gifts come with power and its power comes with consequence. Thus, in the archaeology of absence and the memory of disaster, we find a profound truth: human beings endure not in spite of fragility, but because of it. Fragility is what makes us careful, adaptive, and united. It is what compels us to tell stories, to leave warnings, to pass on wisdom. The drowned people of the ancient world were fragile, but through their memory, their resilience, and their enduring echo in myth, they remain with us, guiding us through our own uncertain future. When the sea swallowed the old world, not everyone was lost. Some survived, not by choice, but by chance, by instinct, by sheer fortune. A mother clutching her child, a fisherman paddling desperately inland, a hunter who happened to be far enough from the shore. These were the unlikely inheritors of a broken world. They did not set out on an odyssey, but catastrophe had forced one upon them. Their journey began not with maps and purpose, but with grief and the weight of memory. The survivors looked back one last time at the waters, still swollen and angry, and saw no trace of the homes they once knew. The earth that had fed them, the hearths that had warmed them, the graves that had held their ancestors, all were gone, erased in a single night. What remained was silence, the eerie quiet of a sea that had already taken too much. And so they turned away, stepping inland into forests and valleys that seemed both familiar and alien. Every footstep carried the heaviness of loss, and every horizon whispered uncertainty. The journey inland was not a simple relocation. It was a test. Without their settled villages, the survivors became wanderers. Food was scarce, and tools lost to the flood had to be remade from whatever could be salvaged. Children cried from hunger, elders fell behind, and the bonds of kinship were stretched to their limits. Yet it was precisely in these moments of struggle that the survivors discovered the core of their endurance. Each act of sharing, each fire kindled on a cold night, was a declaration that they would not surrender to despair. Along the way, new landscapes offered both promise and peril. Rivers shimmered with fish, but their currents could drag the unwary to their deaths. Forests provided shelter and fruit, but also concealed predators. The survivors learned anew how to read the land, to listen for the subtle signs of change, the movement of animals, the direction of winds, the taste of water. What had been routine knowledge in their drowned homeland now became the essential tools of a migrating people. Every step inland was an education in survival. But perhaps the greatest weight they carried was not hunger, nor fatigue, but memory. Each survivor bore within them the echo of the drowned world. Around evening fires, they spoke of what was lost, the sound of waves against familiar shores, the smell of hearth smoke rising from clustered homes, the laughter of children playing in fields now buried beneath the sea. These stories became their inheritance, their link to a vanished place. They told them not just to remember, but to remind themselves who they were and who they must remain, even in exile. As they moved inland, their odyssey was not just physical but spiritual. Catastrophe had shattered the illusion of permanence, and so the survivors sought meaning. Some turned to the spirits of the land, seeking guidance in the rustling of trees or the flight of birds. Others spoke of the sea as a living force, a power that must forever be appeased. Their journey became a pilgrimage, not toward a known destination, but toward understanding, an attempt to reconcile the fragility of human life with the vastness of nature's will. Generations later, these journeys would harden into traditions. Descendants of the survivors would tell of their ancestors' migration as a sacred tale, a founding myth that explained not only where they had come from, but why they must live with humility before the forces of nature. The odyssey of their forebears became more than a memory. It became identity. They were no longer simply wanderers or refugees. They were the people who had survived the sea. In this way, the odyssey transformed suffering into story and story into culture. Along the trail of their migration, sacred places emerged, a mountain peak where a group found refuge during a storm, a valley where hunters returned with enough food to feed the starving, a river bend where children were born after months of hardship. Each place was marked not only in geography, but in memory, becoming part of the survivors' living map of resilience. The odyssey was long, but it was not endless. Eventually, the survivors reached places where the land allowed them to stop, to breathe, to build again. They planted crops on new soil, set stones for new hearths, and buried their dead with rites that carried echoes of the drowned homeland. Yet even in these new settlements, the sea was never forgotten. Songs were sung of the night the water rose, and children grew up knowing that beneath the waves lay the bones of their ancestors and the ghosts of their former lives. Thus, the odyssey was never truly over. For though the survivors' feet stopped moving, their minds and stories continued to wander back to what was lost. The journey became eternal, passed down in words, rituals, and myths. It became a warning: never forget the power of the sea, never grow too attached to the permanence of land, never take for granted the balance between human life and the forces of nature. And so, the survivor's odyssey was not merely a passage from one land to another. It was a passage from one way of being to another, from settled villagers to exiled wanderers, from certainty to humility, from permanence to memory. Out of catastrophe, they discovered endurance. Out of fragility, they shaped resilience. Their odyssey was, in truth, the beginning of a new people, a people forged in loss but bound together by the strength of survival. The drowned plains remained forever behind them, unreachable, invisible beneath the waves. But in their hearts, the survivors carried a map far more enduring than any land could provide, a map made of memory, of grief, of resilience, and of hope. And as long as their stories were told, the Odyssey continued, a journey not across distance, but across time, leading from the ancient past into the present and perhaps into the future as well. Time has a way of softening memory, of sanding down the sharp edges of grief until only its outline remains. Yet, for the descendants of those who survived the Great Flood, the past never disappeared. It echoed. It carried across generations, not as a single voice but as a chorus, 1,000 whispers, 1,000 fragments of a world submerged. The children of the survivors grew up in new lands, among forests and hills untouched by saltwater. They never saw the villages that had been swallowed, never touched the beaches that once bore the footprints of their grandparents. And yet, in their lullabies and bedtime stories, they lived within that drowned world. To them, it was not simply a memory. It was a warning and a myth, a reminder of the fragility of human life. Around fires, elders spoke of the night the water rose. They described the roaring sound, like the sky itself collapsing, the black wall that swept away everything known. They spoke of the fear but also of the resilience, of how their ancestors walked inland, hungry and broken, yet unyielding. Children listened, wide-eyed, imagining waves taller than trees, oceans swallowing stars. And though these tales grew embellished, embroidered with detail that blurred fact and legend, their essence remained true. Generations learned to live with this inherited memory. They adapted their rituals, reshaped their customs, and encoded the flood into every layer of their culture. Weddings included offerings to the waters, prayers that the union would not be washed away. Harvest festivals ended with moments of silence, honoring the drowned soil that had once fed their people. Even language carried the echo, metaphors of floods, tides, and storms appeared in everyday speech, constant reminders of the forces that had shaped their identity. The flood became more than history. It became myth. Myths are not lies, but truths expressed in symbols. For these people, the ocean was no longer just a body of water. It was a presence, a force that could bless or destroy, a spirit both nurturing and cruel. Songs were sung to the sea, not as poetry, but as necessity, as if by remembering they could prevent forgetting, and by preventing forgetting, they could protect themselves from repetition. As the centuries passed, the echoes spread further. Groups of survivors drifted into new regions, carrying the story with them like a sacred flame. Villages, hundreds of miles apart, shared the same tale of a night when the sea rose and devoured the world. The details shifted. Some spoke of rain that fell for endless days, others of a serpent from the deep, others still of gods punishing human pride. Yet beneath the differences lay a single, shared origin, memory of a disaster that had once been real. Archaeology tells us that flood myths appear in nearly every culture. From Mesopotamia's Epic of Gilgamesh to the biblical tale of Noah, to indigenous stories across Asia, Africa, and the Americas, the theme repeats: humanity tested by waters, survival against impossible odds, a new beginning carved from loss. These myths are not coincidences. They are echoes passed down from the survivors of ancient floods, reshaped by time but never silenced. For the descendants of our drowned people, the story was not simply something to be told, it was something to be lived. Every generation saw themselves as the link in an unbroken chain, carrying the memory of catastrophe so that it would not vanish. In doing so, they gave the flood a strange immortality. The waters that had destroyed their villages continued to ripple across time, shaping culture long after the physical waves had receded. But echoes can also change. With each retelling, the flood took on new meanings. For some, it was a warning of nature's power. For others, it was a moral tale, a punishment for arrogance, a lesson in humility. Still others turned it into prophecy, believing that the sea would rise again to cleanse the world when humanity strayed too far. Thus, memory became myth, and myth became prophecy, ensuring that the flood was not just something remembered, but something expected. This was the paradox of survival. The further away the descendants moved in time and distance, the less they suffered the material loss of the flood, and yet, the more they were shaped by its story. It became the cornerstone of their worldview, their explanation for why suffering existed, and their justification for the rituals they performed. In this way, even those who had never seen the sea lived in its shadow. And perhaps this was the true legacy of the drowned people, not the ruins buried beneath the waves, but the resilience of memory itself. The ocean had taken their homes, their fields, their ancestors' bones. But it could not take the story. The story endured, carried on the breath of parents teaching their children, carved into song and ritual, bound into the very rhythm of language. Long after the floodwaters had receded, its echo was louder than ever. As centuries turned into millennia, the myth of the Great Flood traveled so far that its original origin was forgotten. People who lived in deserts, who had never seen a wave higher than their knee, still told tales of the sea's wrath. They believed in floods not because they remembered them directly, but because the memory had traveled through countless generations, echoing across time until it became part of the human imagination itself. And so, when we speak of the flood today, whether in ancient myths or modern science, we are still hearing those echoes. The voices of the survivors whisper through us. They remind us that our civilizations, no matter how mighty, rest always at the mercy of water. They remind us that stories, more than stone or bone, are the true survivors of catastrophe. The drowned land is gone, lost beneath the tides. But the people who once walked its shores are not forgotten. Their voices carry still, echoing across generations, across cultures, across history. And as long as we tell their story, they will never truly be silent. For centuries, flood myths were treated as nothing more than legends, symbolic tales crafted by ancient peoples to explain the cruelty of nature. But in the last 100 years, science has peeled back the layers of story, revealing that beneath the poetry, there often lies history. Behind the echoes of gods and serpents, of endless rains and vengeful oceans, stand real floods, real landscapes, and real people. Geology is the first voice of science in this story. The earth is written in stone, in layers of sediment that serve as the diary of time. Along ancient coastlines, scientists have found unmistakable traces of catastrophic floods, sudden deposits of sand in places where rivers never reached deep inland, shells belonging to marine life, fields of boulders carried impossibly far by surging water. Each layer is a signature, a timestamp, a silent testimony to a day when the world was drowned. The most dramatic of these scientific discoveries points to the end of the last ice age, some 12,000 years ago. As the planet warmed, glaciers that had covered vast parts of the earth began to melt. Massive lakes formed at their edges, dammed by walls of ice. When those ice walls broke, they unleashed torrents that reshaped continents. In North America, the breaking of Lake Agassiz sent water rushing across the land with such violence that entire landscapes were carved anew. In Europe and Asia, melting glaciers fed rising seas, submerging coastal plains where countless human communities once thrived. But perhaps the most evocative scientific thread is found around the Black Sea. Archaeologists and geologists studying its shores have uncovered signs of a sudden, catastrophic flooding event around 7,500 years ago. At that time, the Black Sea was a freshwater lake, isolated from the Mediterranean. Then, as global sea levels rose, the waters of the Mediterranean broke through the Bosporus Strait with unimaginable force. Saltwater poured in at a rate some estimate was hundreds of times greater than Niagara Falls. The flood drowned villages and farmland, transforming the lake into the sea we know today. For the people living along its shores, the event would have been nothing short of apocalyptic. Could this flood have inspired the legends of Noah, of Utnapishtim in Gilgamesh, of Deucalion in Greek myth? Some scientists believe so. The similarities between the stories, a world drowned, a chosen few surviving, a new beginning from devastation, are too striking to ignore. While no single flood can explain every myth, the scientific evidence shows us that massive, civilization-shaping deluges did happen, and they happened to people very much like us. Anthropology adds another dimension. Myths are not random inventions, they are cultural memory. Just as families pass down heirlooms, communities pass down stories. A tale of survival told by one generation becomes a parable for the next. Details may shift, gods added here, animals there, but the core remains. And in this way, stories outlast stone. Around the world, anthropologists have documented indigenous flood traditions that predate contact with other civilizations. In Australia, Aboriginal communities tell of rising seas swallowing coastal lands, stories consistent with geological evidence of sea level rise more than 7,000 years ago. In India, myths speak of the god Vishnu saving humanity from a great deluge, a tale that may echo floods along the ancient Sarasvati and Indus rivers. In the Americas, native tribes recount floods that wiped away earlier peoples, leaving only a handful to repopulate the earth. Each story, once dismissed as superstition, now gains new weight when viewed through the lens of geology and archaeology. They are not fantasies. They are memories, fossilized in language, preserved through culture. Science also teaches us that floods are not relics of the past. They are part of Earth's rhythm. The oceans rise and fall, climates warm and cool, rivers shift course. Today, satellite imagery shows us drowned coastlines stretching for miles beneath the sea, where once forests grew and people walked. In the North Sea, scientists have mapped Doggerland, a vast plain that once connected Britain to mainland Europe. Around 8,000 years ago, rising seas and a catastrophic tsunami swallowed it whole. Archaeologists find traces of its people in fishing nets, hearths, and tools, remnants of a lost world that now lies silent beneath the waves. And yet, while science reveals the mechanics, it cannot capture the experience. Charts of sea levels do not tell us how it felt to watch one's home disappear. Maps of drowned continents do not echo the sound of children crying on higher ground, or the silence of villages erased forever. This is where myth and science meet. Myth tells us how it felt, science tells us how it happened. Together, they form a fuller picture of the past than either could alone. The science beneath the story is not just about the past. It is also a mirror for the present. Today, as our planet warms again, glaciers retreat once more. Seas creep higher along coastlines where half of humanity now lives. Cities like Jakarta, Miami, and Shanghai are already grappling with waters that refuse to stay still. What ancient peoples experienced in weeks or days, we experience across decades, but the scale, the inevitability, feels hauntingly familiar. We stand where they once stood, watching waters rise, wondering if we will endure. And perhaps, in their stories, there is more than memory. Perhaps there is also wisdom. The ancients did not forget. They encoded their suffering into tales so vivid that, thousands of years later, we still tell them. They remind us that floods are not just natural disasters, but human ones. They take more than land. They take culture, continuity, identity. The science beneath the story, then, is not cold data. It is human history written in water and stone. It is a reminder that our myths carry truths that can help us understand where we come from and where we may be headed. The drowned people are gone, but through both science and story, their voices rise again, warning us, guiding us, reminding us of the delicate balance we call civilization. For centuries, flood myths were treated as nothing more than legends, symbolic tales crafted by ancient peoples to explain the cruelty of nature. But in the last 100 years, science has peeled back the layers of story, revealing that beneath the poetry, there often lies history. Behind the echoes of gods and serpents, of endless rains and vengeful oceans, stand real floods, real landscapes, and real people. Geology is the first voice of science in this story. The earth is written in stone, in layers of sediment that serve as the diary of time. Along ancient coastlines, scientists have found unmistakable traces of catastrophic floods, sudden deposits of sand in places where rivers never reached deep inland, shells belonging to marine life, fields of boulders carried impossibly far by surging water. Each layer is a signature, a timestamp, a silent testimony to a day when the world was drowned. The most dramatic of these scientific discoveries points to the end of the last ice age, some 12,000 years ago. As the planet warmed, glaciers that had covered vast parts of the earth began to melt. Massive lakes formed at their edges, dammed by walls of ice. When those ice walls broke, they unleashed torrents that reshaped continents. In North America, the breaking of Lake Agassiz sent water rushing across the land with such violence that entire landscapes were carved anew. In Europe and Asia, melting glaciers fed rising seas, submerging coastal plains where countless human communities once thrived. But perhaps the most evocative scientific thread is found around the Black Sea. Archaeologists and geologists studying its shores have uncovered signs of a sudden, catastrophic flooding event around 7,500 years ago. At that time, the Black Sea was a freshwater lake, isolated from the Mediterranean. Then, as global sea levels rose, the waters of the Mediterranean broke through the Bosporus Strait with unimaginable force. Saltwater poured in at a rate some estimate was hundreds of times greater than Niagara Falls. The flood drowned villages and farmland, transforming the lake into the sea we know today. For the people living along its shores, the event would have been nothing short of apocalyptic. Could this flood have inspired the legends of Noah, of Utnapishtim in Gilgamesh, of Deucalion in Greek myth? Some scientists believe so. The similarities between the stories, a world drowned, a chosen few surviving, a new beginning from devastation, are too striking to ignore. While no single flood can explain every myth, the scientific evidence shows us that massive, civilization-shaping deluges did happen, and they happened to people very much like us. Anthropology adds another dimension. Myths are not random inventions, they are cultural memory. Just as families pass down heirlooms, communities pass down stories. A tale of survival told by one generation becomes a parable for the next. Details may shift, gods added here, animals there, but the core remains. And in this way, stories outlast stone. Around the world, anthropologists have documented indigenous flood traditions that predate contact with other civilizations. In Australia, Aboriginal communities tell of rising seas swallowing coastal lands, stories consistent with geological evidence of sea level rise more than 7,000 years ago. In India, myths speak of the god Vishnu saving humanity from a great deluge, a tale that may echo floods along the ancient Sarasvati and Indus rivers. In the Americas, native tribes recount floods that wiped away earlier peoples, leaving only a handful to repopulate the earth. Each story, once dismissed as superstition, now gains new weight when viewed through the lens of geology and archaeology. They are not fantasies. They are memories, fossilized in language, preserved through culture. Science also teaches us that floods are not relics of the past. They are part of Earth's rhythm. The oceans rise and fall, climates warm and cool, rivers shift course. Today, satellite imagery shows us drowned coastlines stretching for miles beneath the sea, where once forests grew and people walked. In the North Sea, scientists have mapped Doggerland, a vast plain that once connected Britain to mainland Europe. Around 8,000 years ago, rising seas and a catastrophic tsunami swallowed it whole. Archaeologists find traces of its people in fishing nets, hearths, and tools, remnants of a lost world that now lies silent beneath the waves. And yet, while science reveals the mechanics, it cannot capture the experience. Charts of sea levels do not tell us how it felt to watch one's home disappear. Maps of drowned continents do not echo the sound of children crying on higher ground, or the silence of villages erased forever. This is where myth and science meet. Myth tells us how it felt, science tells us how it happened. Together, they form a fuller picture of the past than either could alone. The science beneath the story is not just about the past. It is also a mirror for the present. Today, as our planet warms again, glaciers retreat once more. Seas creep higher along coastlines where half of humanity now lives. Cities like Jakarta, Miami, and Shanghai are already grappling with waters that refuse to stay still. What ancient peoples experienced in weeks or days, we experience across decades, but the scale, the inevitability, feels hauntingly familiar. We stand where they once stood, watching waters rise, wondering if we will endure. And perhaps, in their stories, there is more than memory. Perhaps there is also wisdom. The ancients did not forget. They encoded their suffering into tales so vivid that, thousands of years later, we still tell them. They remind us that floods are not just natural disasters, but human ones. They take more than land. They take culture, continuity, identity. The science beneath the story, then, is not cold data. It is human history written in water and stone. It is a reminder that our myths carry truths that can help us understand where we come from and where we may be headed. The drowned people are gone, but through both science and story, their voices rise again, warning us, guiding us, reminding us of the delicate balance we call civilization. Beneath the restless skin of the ocean, where sunlight can no longer reach and color fades into muted blue, lies a realm of silence. It is a silence unlike that of a desert or an empty plain. It is dense, crushing, endless. Pressure builds with each meter downward, and sound behaves in strange ways, distorted and stretched. The sea floor is a place where time seems suspended, where the ordinary rules of life vanish, and only endurance remains. This is where the ocean keeps its memories. If myths are carved into stone and stories passed down by word, then the ocean writes its history in sediment and silt. The ruins it swallows are not lost, but hidden, preserved in a darkness that resists intrusion. To look upon them is to enter a library whose books are written in silence. For archaeologists and explorers, the sea is both an adversary and a sanctuary. On land, ruins rise, weathered but visible. They wait for us to rediscover them. Underwater, the process is more complex. Salt corrodes, currents scatter, creatures reclaim. Wood dissolves, fabric vanishes, walls collapse. And yet, paradoxically, the ocean also preserves. In the absence of oxygen, decay slows. Statues lie where they fell, mosaics remain intact, pottery rests in silt as though placed in careful storage. Entire landscapes, villages, temples, harbors, remain untouched for thousands of years, waiting for the day we finally descend to them. Consider the Mediterranean. Off the coast of Egypt lies Thonis Heracleion, a city lost to the sea more than a millennium ago. For centuries, it was remembered only in whispers, doubted by historians, half dismissed as legend. Then, in the late 20th century, divers discovered colossal statues toppled across the seabed, fragments of temples, streets, and coins that once passed through countless hands. Even now, the ruins remain cloaked in sand, their silence speaking louder than any surviving text. They remind us that the ocean is a keeper of memory, both cruel in its power and generous in its preservation. But Thonis Heracleion is young compared to the submerged worlds of prehistory. Off the coast of India, near Dvarka, lie stone formations that some believe predate the earliest known cities by thousands of years. Off the coast of Japan, the Yonaguni monument rises like a drowned staircase, massive terraces and blocks descending into darkness. Whether entirely natural or partly shaped by human hands, its presence forces us to question what else the ocean may conceal. The deeper we look, the more the silence whispers of forgotten epochs. In Europe, the North Sea covers Doggerland, once a vast plain connecting Britain to the continent. During the Ice Age, it was a fertile home to hunter-gatherers. Forests stretched across it, rivers meandered, animals grazed. Families built camps, cooked meals, and buried their dead. Today, nothing remains visible, but fishermen still dredge up fragments from the deep: bone, harpoons, carved antlers, stones blackened by ancient fires. Each artifact is a syllable in the ocean's quiet language, fragments of a story otherwise erased. The silence of the seafloor is not empty silence. It is charged with memory. When divers descend into ruins, their senses are altered. Every movement disturbs the silt, creating ghostly clouds. Sounds of breathing echo in helmets, amplified and unnatural. The weight of the water presses against the body, a reminder that this is not a human realm. The sea resists intrusion. It is not eager to give up its secrets. And yet, technology pushes the boundary. Sonar scans map hidden coastlines. Remote vehicles capture images of submerged ruins no diver could reach. Sub-bottom profilers reveal traces of ancient rivers buried beneath sand. Slowly, the silence begins to translate into data, into maps, into knowledge. The sea's memory becomes legible, one discovery at a time. But even with our tools, the ocean remains vast. For every ruin uncovered, countless others lie hidden or destroyed. Civilizations that lasted centuries may now be reduced to a single tool, a shard of pottery, or a faint outline of postholes beneath the seabed. We must accept that most of the ocean's silence will remain untranslated. The archive is too large, the pages too scattered. Still, there is poetry in this silence. The sea floor does not simply erase, it transforms. Cities that once rang with voices now echo with whale song. Marketplaces are patrolled by fish. Temples are colonized by coral. What was once human becomes woven into the larger story of the ocean itself. The silence is not sterile, it is alive, dynamic, ever-changing, even as it conceals. This raises deeper questions. What is permanence? Every city is built as if to resist time. Every wall, every monument, every grave declares, "We will last." Yet beneath the waves, permanence is revealed for what it truly is: fragile, temporary, subject to forces far greater than human will. The silence of the sea floor strips away illusion and leaves us with humility. And perhaps that is why flood myths endure across cultures. The people who first watched their homes vanish beneath rising waters knew the truth: permanence is an illusion. They saw villages erased, not over centuries, but in a single storm, a single surge. Their descendants remembered, and their stories became warnings. In silence, the sea continues that warning. Yet this silence is not despairing. It is contemplative. To look upon the ruins of a drowned city is not only to see an ending but to witness continuity. For the ocean did not end those lives entirely. Their echoes remain, in artifacts, in legends, in the awe we feel standing on the shore. The silence reminds us of fragility, but also of resilience. For as long as memory persists, nothing is ever entirely gone. In the end, the silence of the seafloor is not emptiness but fullness, full of history, full of meaning, full of voices we cannot quite hear but can still imagine. It is an archive without books, a museum without glass, a cathedral whose hymns are composed of pressure and current. To stand at the edge of the ocean is to be reminded that beneath us lies not only wilderness but civilization, forgotten, transformed, silent but still present. And in that silence, if we listen closely, we hear more than absence. We hear the weight of time, the resilience of memory, and the eternal conversation between humanity and the sea. Memory is not light. It does not drift freely, untethered. It has weight. It anchors itself to places, to objects, to stories that persist through generations. When the sea swallows a people, what remains is not only ruins beneath the waves, but the burden carried by those who remember, and by those who inherit that remembering centuries later. For the survivors of any great flood, memory was not abstract. It was tangible. It lived in the empty space where a home once stood, in the absence of familiar voices, in the grief etched into faces. When entire villages were erased, the survivors bore the task of telling. They carried not only their own trauma, but the obligation to preserve what had been lost. To forget would mean allowing the ocean to consume everything, not just the buildings, not just the lives, but the very meaning of what had happened. And so, they remembered. They told stories around fires, they carved symbols, they passed down warnings. The weight of memory became a tool for survival. This happened to us, they said. Do not forget. Build higher. Stay watchful. Listen to the ocean, for it does not always sleep. This is why flood myths appear across continents, across cultures that never touched one another. From Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, from the Pacific Islands to the Arctic, stories of rising waters persist. Some are dramatic, describing gods in anger, entire worlds wiped clean. Others are intimate, a family fleeing, a single boat carrying seeds and animals to safety. Whether cosmic or personal, they serve the same purpose, to preserve memory, to give weight to what must never be forgotten. The weight of memory also lives in artifacts. A shard of pottery, a stone tool, a bead carved by hand, each is more than an object. It is the physical residue of a life lived, of hands that shaped and carried and used. Archaeologists often describe holding such artifacts with reverence. They are small, fragile, ordinary, and yet, they carry immense weight. They are proof against silence, tangible anchors to stories otherwise lost. But memory is not carried equally. For those who survived floods, memory was heavy with sorrow. For their descendants, it became layered with meaning, warning, myth, identity. And for us, standing millennia later, memory is transformed again. We inherit fragments, partial truths, whispers that drift through time. The weight is no longer personal grief, but philosophical reflection. What does it mean to know that whole peoples vanished, that oceans hold civilizations we will never meet? The weight of memory becomes the weight of humility. And yet, there is also beauty in this burden. To carry memory is to keep connection alive. The ocean erases landscapes, but it cannot erase remembrance. Each story we tell, each ruin we study, each myth we retell gives shape to what was lost. The people swallowed by the sea do not vanish entirely, they live within the weight we bear. This is why memorials matter, both ancient and modern. Across the world, cultures build stone circles, burial mounds, temples aligned with the stars. Many of these structures endured floods and earthquakes, yet they remain as vessels of memory. They say to us, we were here. We mattered. Remember. Today, we do the same, erecting monuments to wars, disasters, and tragedies. The instinct is timeless. To memorialize is to distribute the weight of memory across generations, so that it does not vanish when one life ends. But memory also has a cost. For survivors, remembering can mean reliving pain. For descendants, it can mean inheriting fear. Flood myths, while warnings, are also shadows. They remind us not only of what happened, but of what could happen again. They burden us with the knowledge of fragility. This is the paradox of memory. It preserves identity, but it also preserves vulnerability. Yet, without memory, we are rootless. Without weight, we drift. Imagine a world where survivors of great floods chose silence, where no myths were told, no stories shared, no artifacts preserved. Entire peoples would have vanished twice, once in reality, once in remembrance. To carry weight, then, is not a curse, but a responsibility. Modern science adds another layer. When geologists and archaeologists uncover evidence of ancient floods, when they map drowned coastlines or analyze sediment cores, they too are participating in memory. Their data is not just numbers, it is remembrance made measurable. The weight of memory here is intellectual, yet it is no less profound. Each discovery adds to the collective story, ensuring that the silence of the sea does not erase the voices entirely. And we, the listeners, the audience, also carry weight. By hearing these stories, by engaging with myths and ruins, we take part in the chain of remembrance. Every time we retell a story of a vanished people, every time we reflect on the fragility of human settlement against the power of nature, we bear the weight anew. In this way, memory is shared, distributed across countless minds, lighter for each individual, but heavier as a whole. There is also a moral dimension. Memory is not only about what was, but about what must not happen again. Survivors of floods used memory as a warning. Today, in a time when seas rise once more, we face the same challenge. Will we carry memory wisely? Will we use it to adapt, to prepare, to respect the power of the ocean? Or will we let the weight slip, leaving future generations to relearn the lesson in tragedy? The weight of memory, then, is not passive. It is active, dynamic, shaping choices and futures. To carry it is to stand in continuity with those who came before. To neglect it is to risk repeating their losses. In the end, memory is both anchor and sail. It grounds us in what has been, reminding us of fragility, of impermanence. But it also propels us forward, giving us stories, wisdom, and resilience. When the ocean swallowed entire peoples, it did not swallow memory. That burden remained above the waves, carried from parent to child, from myth to myth, from ruin to ruin. And now it rests with us. The weight of memory is heavy, yes, but it is also sacred. It is the means by which the lost remain part of the living world. To carry it is not only to look back with sorrow, but to look forward with understanding. The ocean swallowed lives, but it could not swallow meaning. That survives, in silence, in story, in us. Legends are like rivers. They flow across time, carrying fragments of truth, reshaping themselves as they move. In one village, a flood story is whispered as a caution to children. In another, thousands of miles away, the same theme takes form as a sacred myth of gods and justice. Across continents, across languages and landscapes, the echo of rising waters persists. And though the details shift, the names of gods, the shape of the boat, the number of survivors, the core remains the same. The sea once rose, and humanity endured only by a thread. Consider Mesopotamia, the land between rivers. Here, thousands of years ago, scribes etched the epic of Gilgamesh onto clay tablets. Within its verses lies the tale of Utnapishtim, a man forewarned by the gods to build a vessel against the coming flood. His story predates even the Bible's Noah, yet the similarities are unmistakable. A chosen man, a great ark, animals saved, the world remade. Was this purely myth, or did it spring from memories of rivers that swelled beyond measure, drowning the fields of Sumer? To the people of Mesopotamia, the flood was not metaphor alone, it was lived reality refracted into legend. Travel east to India. In Hindu tradition, we find the tale of Manu, a man who rescues life from destruction when warned by a fish, an incarnation of the god Vishnu. Manu builds a boat, ties it to the horn of the great fish, and rides out the deluge. In this story, divine compassion mingles with the cosmic cycle. The flood does not merely punish, it resets, purifies, and makes way for new creation. Once again, we find the same shape, water rising, humanity clinging to survival, memory cast forward in myth. Further east still, in China, the legend of Yu the Great tells not of an ark, but of heroism against the waters. The floods in these stories are relentless, submerging valleys, swallowing villages. But Yu does not flee. He fights. For years, he labors, dredging rivers, carving channels, mastering the flood through perseverance. The Chinese myth transforms the flood into a story not of escape, but of mastery, of human ingenuity against chaos. In this retelling, the waters are not divine wrath but a challenge, one that shapes the identity of a civilization. Now turn west to Greece. The myth of Deucalion and Pyrrha tells of Zeus's anger at human corruption. To cleanse the earth, he sends a flood, sparing only Deucalion and his wife, who survive by building a chest-like vessel. When the waters recede, they repopulate the earth by casting stones behind them, which transform into humans. Here again, the flood destroys in order to renew. The sea becomes both executioner and womb, wiping clean the old to make way for the new. Cross the Atlantic, and we find similar echoes among the indigenous peoples of the Americas. In the high Andes, the Inca spoke of Viracocha, who sent a great flood to destroy giants that once roamed the earth. In Mesoamerica, the Maya told of successive creations and destructions, one of which came by flood. Among North American tribes, from the Hopi to the Ojibwe, we hear of waters rising, of canoes carrying survivors, of animals aiding in the rebirth of land. In some versions, it is a muskrat, humble and small, who dives into the waters to bring back a grain of earth from which new land is formed. These tales, though rooted in unique cultures, still share the same rhythm of deluge and rebirth. Even in the far islands of the Pacific, on atolls barely above sea level, flood legends persist. Polynesian myths speak of gods who tested mortals with rising seas, of heroic voyages to escape submerged homelands. For islanders who lived in direct dialogue with the ocean, such stories were not distant allegory. They were survival manuals encoded in song. And then, in the Arctic, among the Inuit, we hear of great waves sweeping across ice and tundra, carrying hunters far from home, leaving them to found new clans in distant places. The flood is not only a destroyer here, but a disperser, scattering people into new beginnings. What are we to make of this astonishing chorus? How is it that peoples, separated by oceans, mountains, and millennia, tell stories that echo so closely? Scholars debate. Some argue for shared memory, that at the end of the Ice Age, when glaciers melted and seas surged, humanity endured floods so catastrophic they imprinted themselves into collective memory. Others see convergent imagination. Water, after all, is universal, and its danger self-evident. Perhaps floods are a natural symbol of chaos, destruction, and renewal, arising independently wherever humans settled near rivers and coasts. Yet perhaps it is both. Memory and imagination, reality and myth, braided together like rivers joining the sea. The stories endure because they speak not only of past events, but of eternal truths. Water is life-giver and life-taker. It nourishes, it destroys. To live near it is to live in awareness of fragility. And so, the legends endure, retold in temples, in villages, in sacred chants and fireside tales. But beyond their origins, the power of flood legends lies in their universality. They remind us that humanity, though scattered, is connected. A Sumerian farmer, a Polynesian voyager, a Hopi storyteller, a Chinese emperor, all wrestled with the same fear, that the waters might rise and erase everything. And all, in their own way, transformed that fear into story, into meaning, into lessons for survival. Legends across continents serve as mirrors. They reflect our common vulnerability, but also our resilience. They remind us that civilizations rise and fall, yet memory flows onward. Myths are not frivolous fancies, they are vessels of remembrance. They carry not only warnings of disaster, but also hope, that from destruction comes renewal, that from loss comes rebirth. And so, as we listen to these stories today, we are not merely hearing distant echoes of ancient voices. We are entering the same current of human experience. We too live in an age of rising seas, of changing climates, of fragile coasts. The legends of old are no longer distant curiosities. They are reminders, heavy with relevance. They tell us what our ancestors already knew: the waters always return. The question is not if, but when. Beneath the rolling waves lies a silence that is not empty, but brimming with memory. For millennia, the ocean has been the great archive, concealing within its depths the ruins of human lives, entire landscapes swallowed and preserved. If myths gave us poetry, science now gives us tools, ways of reading the drowned world as if it were a book written in stone, coral, and sediment. This section is not about the songs of memory, but the methods of revelation, how researchers peel back the ocean's shroud to uncover the truth behind the flood stories of the past. The first clue is the sea floor itself. Bathymetric surveys, maps of underwater topography created using sonar, have revealed coastlines that no longer exist, ancient valleys drowned by rising waters, and riverbeds now entombed beneath the sea. Where once plains stretched wide, now the seabed drops into silence. Off the coast of Britain, for example, lies Doggerland, a vanished world that once connected England to mainland Europe. Sonar sweeps and sediment cores have revealed drowned forests, ancient shorelines, and the bones of animals that grazed where waves now roll. What was once pasture and hunting ground became seabed, swallowed as ice sheets melted at the end of the last ice age. The process of reading these landscapes is painstaking. Scientists extract long cores of sediment, drilling deep into the seabed. Each layer tells a story: grains of sand that speak of rivers, clays that whisper of stagnant lagoons, marine shells that signal the arrival of the sea. By dating these layers, researchers reconstruct the timeline of inundation, charting when the waters advanced, how quickly they swallowed the land, and how people may have responded. Sediment becomes testimony, quiet yet precise. But it is not only the ground that speaks, the ocean itself carries memory in its chemistry. Within coral reefs, growth rings preserve the story of rising and falling seas, like tree rings recording the passage of years. Corals thrive in shallow waters near the surface. When sea levels change, their growth shifts, leaving behind stone records of drowning or emergence. By sampling ancient reefs, scientists piece together a global picture of sea level rise, understanding not only where but when the waters surged. And then there are the ruins. Off the coast of India, in the Gulf of Khambhat, sonar has revealed the outlines of structures, walls, steps, and what some argue are the remnants of entire cities. Divers exploring the Bay of Cambay and other sites have brought up artifacts, pottery and stones shaped by human hands. The dating of these finds remains controversial, with skeptics urging caution and advocates insisting they point to civilizations far older than we imagined. Regardless of conclusion, such discoveries ignite curiosity. How much of our early human story lies hidden beneath the waves? Farther east, off the coast of Japan, the submerged formations of Yonaguni stir similar debates. Massive stone terraces and steps rise from the seabed like a sunken pyramid. Are they natural formations, sculpted by currents and tectonic shifts, or the handiwork of ancient builders drowned by rising seas? Whether carved by nature or culture, the effect is the same, a haunting reminder of how the ocean reclaims and obscures. In the Mediterranean, divers have discovered ancient harbors, roads, and temples resting beneath clear blue water. In Alexandria, Egypt, the remnants of Cleopatra's palace lie submerged, toppled by earthquakes and tsunamis long before modern time. Off the coast of Greece, entire Bronze Age settlements have been found under shallow waters, perfectly preserved, their streets and walls still visible. Each ruin is a fragment of human ambition undone by shifting seas and restless earth. Science, however, does more than discover ruins. It also explains the forces that brought the waters. At the end of the last ice age, glaciers that had gripped vast portions of the planet melted, releasing unimaginable volumes of water. Between 12,000 and 6,000 years ago, sea levels rose more than 120 meters, reshaping continents and drowning coastlines. This was not a single gentle tide, but a series of rapid pulses, catastrophic surges known as meltwater pulses. The most dramatic, Meltwater Pulse 1A, around 14,600 years ago, raised global sea levels by nearly 20 meters in just a few centuries. For coastal peoples, this was apocalypse made real, the ocean advancing within a human lifetime. Geologists study these pulses through isotopes in ancient ice cores, through chemical signatures in deep-sea sediments, and through fossilized shorelines etched into cliffs. Together, these data points form a timeline of catastrophe. And with every finding, the gap between myth and history narrows. A global flood may never have happened as one singular event, but regional floods, devastating and relentless, most certainly did. Archaeology joins geology in filling in the picture. Excavations near ancient river deltas reveal abandoned settlements buried beneath layers of silt. In the Black Sea, for instance, sediment cores suggest a dramatic flooding event around 7,600 years ago, when Mediterranean waters surged through the Bosporus and transformed a freshwater lake into the salty sea we know today. Some scholars believe this event may have inspired the flood myths of Mesopotamia, carried downstream by merchants, sailors, and storytellers. And still, there are mysteries. Some submerged sites defy easy explanation, their origins uncertain, their timelines debated. Yet this is the essence of science, not to hand us final answers, but to refine questions, to bring clarity to the shadows. Each discovery is not a conclusion but an invitation to wonder, to reconsider the scale of human memory and loss. Beneath the waves, science and story converge. The sonar maps that reveal ancient valleys echo the legends of drowned homelands. The sediment layers that trace sudden floods mirror the myths of sudden wrath. The ruins that divers explore whisper of once living cities, their people long gone, their presence remembered only in stone. What emerges from this dialogue is not only knowledge but humility. The ocean is vast, and our species has only skimmed its surface. For every Doggerland uncovered, countless other drowned landscapes remain unexplored. For every Yonaguni debated, countless other structures may lie waiting, their outlines blurred by sand and coral. Science beneath the waves reminds us that the ocean is not an enemy, nor a friend, but a force, indifferent, immense, eternal. It rises, it falls, and it carries the imprint of ages. To study it is to confront our own impermanence, to see how fragile the line is between land and sea, between memory and oblivion. And yet, in this fragility lies something beautiful, the chance to listen, to learn, to connect with ancestors who once stood where the sea now rolls. Their voices reach us not only through myth, but through the language of geology, archaeology, and oceanography. Legends and science, together, weave a fuller tapestry, one strand poetic, the other empirical, both pointing to the same truth: the ocean remembers, even when we forget. Silence can be the loudest echo of catastrophe. When waters rise and land is lost, not all are swallowed, some remain. The survivors, scattered on higher ground or along reshaped coasts, carry not only the memory of what was taken, but also the burden of speaking, or of remaining silent. History often remembers disasters by their ruins, but it is the voices of those who endured that breathe humanity into stone and sediment. Yet, so often, their stories come to us not in detail, but in fragments, whispered across generations, reduced to myth or ritual. The silence of the survivors is not emptiness, but a language of its own. In prehistoric times, survival meant adaptation. Communities displaced by floodwaters may have fled inland, leaving behind hearths, graves, and homes. What they carried with them was intangible: memory, warning, grief. In some traditions, this memory transformed into myth, a tale of God's punishment or cosmic balance. In others, it became taboo, a silence enforced by fear, a refusal to speak of what was too painful, too overwhelming. The very act of survival sometimes demands forgetting. Imagine the children of those who escaped the sudden flooding of the Black Sea. Their parents would have witnessed the sea creeping in with terrifying speed, fields turning to marsh, villages swallowed. In their new settlements, perhaps far inland, the children might have asked, "Why did we leave? What lies beneath the waters?" The answers may have been halting, softened, turned into metaphor. Over time, the story ceased to be history and became legend. Silence, once practical, turned into a cultural inheritance. Archaeologists studying displacement patterns often find abrupt cultural shifts in inland sites, sudden influxes of pottery styles, tool forms, or burial customs from coastal peoples who could no longer remain where they once thrived. These shifts hint at migration, at survivors bringing their world into new ones. Yet, the reasons for their movement are rarely recorded. Only silence explains the gap, the missing detail. It is as though the survivors chose not to name their trauma, leaving it to us to infer from absence. The silence was not uniform. In some places, survivors ritualized the flood, ensuring it could not be forgotten. Along the coasts of Australia, Aboriginal oral traditions preserve memories of rising seas that drowned once inhabited lands more than 7,000 years ago. These stories are detailed, tied to specific landmarks now submerged. In their telling, silence is replaced with endurance, a memory kept alive so that the community could navigate loss while affirming its place in the world. Here, survival was not only physical but cultural, language acting as an anchor against the tide of oblivion. In other parts of the world, however, silence may have prevailed. Survivors may have chosen to bury their stories out of fear that speaking them would summon them again. Silence as protection, silence as survival. Communities that endured catastrophic loss often create taboos around it, places not to be named, waters not to be fished, directions not to be traveled. These unspoken boundaries are history in negative space, recorded not in words but in avoidance. Silence also shaped identity. When survivors settled in new lands, they may have absorbed into existing populations, their origins hidden, their past unnamed. Over time, they became part of other stories, their own washed away like the lands they left behind. This merging creates gaps in cultural memory. We know from archaeology that people moved, but we do not always know why. The silence of survivors can erase, but it also reshapes, blending one narrative into another. And yet, silence can still speak. It speaks in the absence of artifacts, where once there was habitation. It speaks in the empty spaces of oral traditions, where a story begins not at the beginning, but in the middle, with no explanation of why a journey started. It speaks in the myths of floods that do not name the place, only the act. Survivors did not always need to explain themselves. They needed only to endure. This silence is deeply human. Even in modern disasters, survivors often find it difficult to narrate their experiences. Trauma resists language. It can be easier to fall quiet, to let others speculate or imagine. Prehistoric peoples were no different. They endured events of unimaginable scale, and their silence is not failure, but evidence of the enormity of what they faced. In this way, silence itself became part of the inheritance. Later generations, hearing only fragments, filled the gaps with imagination. The flood myths of Mesopotamia, Greece, and beyond may not have been detailed transcripts of survival, but reinterpretations of silences passed down. Where there was absence, imagination rushed in. Where words failed, symbols and gods emerged. The survivors gave the world a paradoxical gift, silence that became the soil for stories. Philosophically, this silence asks us to reflect on the limits of human memory. How much of our own lives will be remembered in detail thousands of years from now? Will the voices of survivors from our age, those displaced by climate-driven floods and rising seas, be remembered as precise accounts, or will they too dissolve into silence, into metaphor? The silence of prehistoric survivors mirrors our own fragility. We too are storytellers who will one day become whispers, fragments, myths. And so, when we look at submerged ruins, at lost coastlines, at myths of great floods, we should listen not only to what is said but to what is unsaid. Silence is not absence. It is presence of another kind, the presence of loss too large for words, of grief too heavy for song, of survival that required moving forward without turning back. The silence of the survivors is ultimately a reminder that endurance is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it is carried not in epic poems, but in unspoken gestures, in migrations, in the decision to live without explanation. What was lost may never be named, but it shaped the survivors' world, and through them, ours. When disaster strikes, humanity instinctively searches for meaning. A flood is not just water rising, it is chaos entering order, nature defying human control. For prehistoric peoples, who had no science of tectonics, no models of sea level rise, no satellite view of storms, the question burned: why did this happen? To endure loss without explanation is unbearable. And so, explanation was born, not in data, but in myth, in the language of gods. When the ocean swallowed entire peoples, it was rarely remembered as an accident of geology. Instead, the flood became a verdict. Gods punished, gods wept, gods fought among themselves, and humanity paid the price. Myth transformed random tragedy into moral narrative. It gave survivors a framework. The water rose not because the earth shifted, but because humans strayed. It was not chaos, it was consequence. Take the Mesopotamian flood stories. The Epic of Gilgamesh and the tale of Atrahasis echo with divine discontent. The gods, overwhelmed by humanity's noise, chose silence by flood. Only one man, warned in a dream, built a vessel to preserve life. The story preserved more than memory of a flood. It encoded a worldview. Disasters happen because gods decree them. Survival comes from favor, wisdom, or obedience. The flood was explained, given moral weight, and thus integrated into culture. This pattern repeats across continents. In Greek mythology, Zeus unleashes a deluge to cleanse the world of corruption, sparing only Deucalion and Pyrrha, who repopulate the earth by casting stones that transform into people. The flood is not mere catastrophe. It is purification. Humanity fails, the gods intervene, and the world begins anew. Here, the survivors are not silent. They are central to a cosmic drama, chosen to restart humanity. In Hindu tradition, Manu is warned by a fish, an avatar of Vishnu, to build a boat before the great flood arrives. The divine does not merely punish, it guides, ensuring the continuity of life. This version reflects a relationship between humans and gods based not only on wrath, but on care. Again, survival is framed not as luck, but as destiny, sanctioned by divine will. Even in the Americas, flood myths abound. Among the Maya, floods appear as instruments of creation and destruction, a way the gods reshaped the world to correct earlier mistakes. In Andean traditions, floods arrive when humanity disrespects the sacred order, forcing renewal. Across the Pacific Islands, oral traditions describe waves that came as a response to broken taboos or as expressions of gods mourning or angered. Everywhere, the waters spoke with the voices of the gods. Why did humanity give the gods the blame? Part of the answer lies in the psychology of survival. To believe catastrophe is random is to admit vulnerability beyond measure. But if the flood is divine punishment, then meaning exists. If humans erred, perhaps they can avoid repeating the error. If the gods are angry, they can be appeased. In this way, myth transforms helplessness into agency, chaos into order. The gods became both explanation and instruction. Philosophically, this impulse reveals something essential. Humans cannot live without narrative. To survive is not only to breathe, but to weave meaning around experience. The flood myths did more than remember disaster. They gave the survivors a moral compass. They explained why some lived and others did not. They reassured communities that their suffering was not senseless but part of a larger order. There is also power in divine blame. Leaders, priests, and shamans could interpret floods as signs, binding communities together in rituals of appeasement. Sacrifice, prayer, taboo, these were not only religious acts but survival strategies, reinforcing unity and discipline in fragile communities. The gods' wrath became a social glue. By blaming the divine, survivors also preserved their own sense of worth. The flood was not their failure alone, it was cosmic. And yet, the gods' role in these myths also reveals tenderness. Not all flood stories are about anger. In some, the gods weep, and their tears become the flood. The waters rise not as punishment, but as mourning, as grief for humanity's pain. Here, divinity mirrors human emotion, offering comfort. The world is not cruel but tragic, shared even by the gods themselves. When gods took the blame, they also carried the weight of memory. Myths ensured that floods were not forgotten. Children learned them as sacred tales, not just stories of water and death, but of morality and survival. By personifying the flood, communities gave it endurance. The myth lasted long after the details of geography and time were lost. In this way, gods became historians, carrying the memory of drowned worlds into eternity. Archaeologists and historians today recognize the fingerprints of real events in these myths. Beneath the supernatural elements lies sediment, literal and cultural. A great flood remembered in Mesopotamia may reflect river floods of the Tigris and Euphrates. Stories from the Pacific Islands may echo tsunamis triggered by undersea earthquakes. The myths may not be true in a literal sense, but they preserve truth in another, the memory of survival framed through gods. The silence of the survivors we explored earlier was often filled by this divine blame. Where human voices faltered, myth spoke. It was easier to say, the gods willed it, than to linger in wordless trauma. In doing so, survivors passed on not silence, but story. The gods became vessels for grief, rage, awe, and fear. Even today, echoes of this impulse remain. Natural disasters are sometimes called acts of God. The phrase, legal and casual, reveals how deep the instinct runs. To attribute chaos to divinity is to make it comprehensible, to fit it into human narrative. The gods still bear the blame, carrying the incomprehensible so we do not have to. And so, when we read the flood myths of ancient peoples, we should not dismiss them as superstition. They are testimonies of survival, refracted through the lens of the sacred. They tell us not only that floods happened, but how humans felt about them, terrified, awed, searching for meaning. The gods were not just explanations, they were companions in trauma, figures large enough to hold the weight of incomprehensible loss. When the waters rose, it was never only geology. For the survivors, it was judgment, mourning, purification, renewal. The gods took the blame because only gods were vast enough to shoulder it. And in that act of divine blame, humanity found its way forward, with story, with ritual, with meaning. The ocean does not forget. Its surface may shimmer with sunlight and lull with rhythm, but beneath lies memory older than mountains, older than nations, older than humanity itself. Every drop carries traces of ancient worlds drowned, every current whispers of lands lost, every tide recycles fragments of the past. For the people who once lived upon its shores, the ocean was both giver and taker, a cradle of life, a path to discovery, and a graveyard of civilizations. And though their voices are gone, the ocean remembers. We often imagine the sea as timeless, unchanged through millennia. Yet the ocean is alive, constantly shifting, remaking the boundaries between land and water. In the Ice Age, when ice sheets held the world's water captive, shorelines stretched far beyond today's coasts. Whole continents, like Doggerland in Europe, connected Britain to the mainland. Rivers carved valleys that are now seabeds. Villages stood where waves now crash. The ocean's memory is written in these drowned landscapes, preserved under layers of sediment, waiting to be rediscovered. Archaeologists uncover this memory piece by piece. Beneath the North Sea, sonar reveals the outlines of rivers, forests, and hunting grounds lost around 8,000 years ago. In the Black Sea, traces of ancient shorelines mark the great flooding that expanded its waters. Off the coasts of India and Japan, submerged temples and settlements hint at thriving communities swallowed by rising seas. Each discovery is a reminder. The ocean does not erase, it buries. And burial is another kind of remembrance. For ancient peoples, the ocean's memory was not geological, but mythic. They sensed its permanence, its ability to keep secrets beyond human lifespan. To them, the drowned world below was not forgotten, but sacred, a liminal space between life and death, past and present. Fishermen casting their nets over ruins, sailors passing above unseen cities, all participated in rituals of remembrance, even if they did not know it. The ocean held their ancestors. It was both archive and tomb. The long memory of the ocean is also recorded in myth. Stories of floods passed down across generations were not only about divine wrath, but about landscapes once familiar that disappeared. A child hearing of a great wave was, in some sense, learning about geography, about how the ocean once reached farther inland, how valleys once held people, how the earth itself could change. These myths became mnemonic devices, cultural memories of real transformations. What science today verifies through cores and scans, myth preserved through story and song. But memory is not only about keeping, it is also about reminding. The ocean has a way of returning the past to us. Storms wash up artifacts long buried. Erosion exposes bones, tools, and pottery from drowned villages. Coral reefs grow upon ruins, shaping monuments in silence. The sea forgets nothing. It simply hides until time and chance reveal its records again. The ocean's memory is not passive. It is active, shaping human destiny even now. Rising seas in our own age echo those of the past, swallowing coastlines and reshaping maps. Entire nations, like the islands of Kiribati or Tuvalu, face the same fate as Doggerland and the drowned villages of prehistory. Humanity, in its modernity, finds itself in the same ancient story, threatened by waters that rise, uncertain how to interpret, compelled to remember. We are relearning what our ancestors knew, that the ocean always keeps the final word. This memory is not cruel, though it may seem merciless. It is cyclical, part of Earth's rhythm. What the sea takes, it transforms. What it buries, it preserves. And what it preserves, it eventually returns. The long memory of the ocean is a reminder of continuity. Civilizations may vanish, but they are not gone. They are carried forward in silt, in salt, in myth, in stone. Humanity's fragility is recorded not in silence, but in waves. Standing on a modern coastline, one can feel this memory. The horizon is not only distance, but depth, not only the present, but the past. Each wave that breaks carries echoes of older seas, older floods, older shores. The whisper of foam against sand is like the murmur of an ancient witness. To listen to the ocean is to listen to time itself, stretched not in years or centuries, but in geological epochs. Philosophically, the ocean's memory confronts us with humility. We build monuments, write histories, craft digital archives, all in hopes of preserving memory. Yet the ocean has been keeping memory effortlessly for millions of years. It holds fossils of the first creatures, shipwrecks of forgotten explorers, remnants of cultures erased from land. Our libraries crumble, but the seabed endures. Perhaps that is why the ocean inspires both awe and fear. It remembers what we cannot, and in remembering, it reminds us of our smallness. And yet, in this smallness lies a strange comfort. If the ocean remembers, then nothing is truly lost. The drowned villages, the people swallowed, the myths whispered, they are all still there, woven into currents and tides. The survivors may have fallen silent, but the sea kept speaking, not in human language, but in the persistence of presence. The ocean, vast and unfathomable, is the great archive of life. When we speak of the ocean swallowing an entire people, we might think of finality. But the ocean's memory shows us otherwise. The people are not gone, they are absorbed into a continuity larger than themselves. Their homes, their tools, their stories, all drift in time, resurfacing in discoveries, in myths, in echoes. The sea swallows, yes, but it also carries. Today, scientists probe the ocean with technology unimaginable to the ancients: satellites, submersibles, sonar. What they find confirms what myths always suggested: the ocean has a memory longer than human history. It remembers floods, extinctions, migrations, disasters. It remembers the rise and fall of continents. And as we learn to read this memory, we come closer not only to understanding the past, but to preparing for the future. Because the ocean does not simply remember, it warns. Its long memory shows patterns, rhythms of rise and fall, signals of change. The drowned past is a map for the drowning future. If we listen, if we learn, we may find guidance in its ancient archive. If we ignore it, we risk repeating the same silence as the survivors of old, who watched the waves rise and could not find words. The ocean remembers. And in its memory, humanity finds both its fragility and its continuity. We are temporary, but not erased. Each flood, each loss, each drowned people lives on, in myth, in sediment, in saltwater song. To stand by the ocean is to stand before the oldest witness, one that never forgets, one that never stops carrying the past forward. The ocean's long memory is not only about what has been swallowed, it is about what still survives within its endless, timeless embrace. And so, as the waves roll against the shore, we are reminded, we walk not only upon land, but upon the edge of memory itself. The ocean keeps what we cannot. It whispers what we fear. And it waits, always, to tell its story again. After the waves receded, silence fell. A silence deeper than absence, heavier than the quiet of night. Where once there had been laughter, the crackle of fire, the rhythm of songs, now there was only stillness. The land, stripped bare, carried the weight of emptiness. The ocean, vast and indifferent, lapped against the shore as though nothing had happened. For those who survived, it was this silence, more than the wave itself, that became unbearable. Human beings are not made for silence. We fill it with voices, with stories, with ritual. Silence unsettles us because it mirrors the unknown. And after the flood, survivors faced not only physical loss but also a silence of memory, whole families gone, entire histories extinguished in a single night. The silence was not only the absence of sound, but the absence of presence. To live on after such an event was to walk in a landscape where every space was haunted by those who were no longer there. What do we do with silence? For ancient peoples, silence became both wound and shrine. The drowned land was remembered not only through myth, but through its silence. Fishermen casting nets over quiet waters knew they cast into graves. Children born after the flood grew up learning to hear the silence as a kind of language, a reminder that the sea demanded respect, that memory could not always be spoken but must sometimes be felt. The silence became sacred, a space where words could not reach. But silence is not always passive. It shapes us. Survivors turn silence into story, carving absence into meaning. Around the world, flood myths begin not with noise but with silence, the silence after destruction, when the world is empty and still. Into that stillness, humans poured imagination, constructing tales of gods, punishments, renewals. Silence demanded explanation, and in answering it, they gave birth to myth. In this way, silence itself became a generative force, a canvas upon which cultures painted their fears and hopes. Silence also teaches humility. When faced with a loss so total, words falter. The survivors of ancient floods could not preserve every detail, every name. Yet in the gaps of silence, meaning survived. The flood was remembered not in census or chronicle, but in the echo of quiet, the stories retold by firelight, the warnings sung in lullabies, the rituals performed by shorelines. Silence became not erasure, but a framework in which memory endured. Philosophically, the silence that remains after disaster forces us to confront impermanence. Human voices rise, echo, fade. Civilizations grow, flourish, collapse. Yet what remains always is silence. It is the canvas of existence, the stage upon which life briefly performs. After the ocean swallowed entire peoples, silence was the most enduring monument. Not ruins, not relics, but the hush of absence. And yet, silence is never truly empty. The ocean filled it with rhythm, the hiss of waves, the groan of tides, the distant cries of seabirds. Survivors would have heard these sounds differently after the flood. Every crash of surf reminded them of the night that changed everything. Every gust of wind carried the memory of voices lost. In this way, silence was not lack but transformation. What once was filled with human sound was now filled with ocean sound, a reminder that nature had taken its place. For modern people, visiting drowned landscapes evokes this same silence. Divers descending upon ruins hear nothing but their own breath, the muted clicks of marine life. Archaeologists scanning seabeds encounter a silence broken only by instruments. Writers and poets reflecting on lost civilizations return again and again to silence as the final echo of catastrophe. It is not noise that lingers, it is quiet. And in quiet, we sense presence more strongly than in sound. The silence that remains is also a mirror. It reflects our own fragility, our own fears of disappearance. To stand at the edge of the sea and imagine entire peoples gone is to feel the weight of mortality. The silence whispers, you too are temporary. And yet, it also whispers something else, you too will be remembered, if not in words, then in silence itself. Because silence is not the end of memory, it is its vessel. The drowned lands, the vanished people, the unspoken stories, all endure in silence. Silence is the keeper of what cannot be told. It is the language of absence, but also of reverence. It holds space for what words cannot reach. And when future generations ask what happened, it is silence, paradoxically, that answers, look, listen, feel, here something once was, and now it is not. In this way, silence becomes not emptiness, but continuity. The survivors who lived after the flood did not rebuild everything, but they carried silence forward. They wove it into rituals, myths, and songs. They treated silence not as void, but as sacred. And we, thousands of years later, still hear it, in the myths of floods, in the unease we feel by restless coasts, in the respect we instinctively give to the sea. The silence that remains is thus not despair, but memory's final form. When words fail, silence speaks. When presence fades, silence endures. And when oceans swallow entire peoples, silence carries them forward, not gone, but transfigured into the quiet that still surrounds us. So, as we end this journey, we return not to sound, but to stillness. The ocean continues its rhythm. The shore remains watchful. And in the silence, we hear the story of those who came before, those who were taken, those who remain only in whispers. Silence is their monument. Silence is their song. And silence, in the end, is what binds us to them.